The motion before the House is that developing nations should sell sovereignty over autonomous zones to entrepreneurs. I think. Something largely like that. It'll come out. My name is Amit and I will be one of the 7 adjudicators. The others are in order: Niharika, Dom, Sandeep, Taz, Stephen Whittington, and Ben Woolgar. Just because there's 2 names, which is Stephen Thompson. As with the round, speaking times 6 to 8 minutes, 1 clap at 6, 2 claps a day. If everyone could please switch off their phones or put them on silent, that would be appreciated. And also please keep chatter and applause and hear-hears and things like that to a respectable amount, if you can, which you can. Alright, so without any further ado, I'll sit down and then call up.
In status quo, we see countries like China and the United Arab Emirates buying individual tracts of land of countries in Indochina and the Central African Republics. And what they basically do is that they let their entrepreneurs take full use of the land where they have sovereignty over to develop and create industries in these regions. The kind of lands that we're specifically talking about here are the kind of lands that are usually sparse, with little vegetation, with little natural benefits, that even the locals themselves in these countries like the Central African Republic and Chad usually don't live in, and they usually populate in regions where the natural benefits do lie. What we're basically trying to do here is to allow them to buy over these tracts of land and allow them to use their superior technology and their superior economic largesse to develop these tracts of land, introduce things, for example, underground system of like piping that will transfer water from faraway regions to these regions to allow them to use it for like, agricultural purposes, or even develop the kind of industries which only they can and create it in a way that only they would, that these home countries never ever could. Now what we're going to do in our policy is quite simple. We're going to follow the economic blueprint that we see in like the Suzhou industrial region or even Hong Kong under the British colonial rule, right? Where we allowed like the Brits to basically take over Hong Kong, develop it to such an extent that China sees it as an inspirational economic model to follow. One of the benefits we're going to talk about. But here's our 7-point policy. The first point we're going to talk about is that it's not going to be a freehold piece of land. We're going to allow it on a leasehold basis, give them for 99 years, but give them complete and full sovereignty over that plot of land for that 99 years. We think that's the best way because we don't think ceding it for like infinity is necessarily a good idea. Secondly, we think that we're going to establish a contract between the home country and countries, for example, China and the UAE, and ensure they provide locals with employment. We suggest putting in a little quota that guarantees the transfer of skills and employment, which we think is going to be beneficial for these people. The third point, we think that these industries or wherever you build within these autonomous regions would have to adhere to labor laws like what the WTO proposes. We think that their natural incentives will ensure that these industries adhere to the labor laws so they maintain or keep themselves within the international framework which benefits the industries. Fourth point, we're going to establish a referendum, make sure that the people actually want to have these industries in, but we don't think that's necessarily a huge obstacle. Even if you can't put in a referendum, we think that we are willing to more or less delegate the duty to the individual state authorities to decide for the people, especially if they have the mandate of the people they're deciding for them. Fifth, what we're going to do, Mr. Speaker, is that we're also going to force them to trade with the local economy. So assuming they use, like for example, these large tracts of land to create for biofuel purposes, what we're going to do is that we're going to compel them to maintain and ensure some of that fuel remains within the local economy because we think there are overwhelming benefits there. Six, what we're going to do also is that we're going to ensure that there's an indigenous representative in the board or in the controlling authority of these autonomous regions. We think this is especially important to give them some idea of what the local culture is like, to give them some representation of what the people want or what the people may need, and that hopefully they'll be open to the idea or the discourse between the two entities themselves within the region itself. And lastly, and most importantly, to concretize our policy, what we're going to do is that in the event any of these conditions are broken by the autonomous region itself, what we're going to do is that we're either going to cancel the contract or we're going to empower our military to cross the boundaries, go into there and forcibly take them in again. But we think that the threat in itself is going to be particularly effective because of the inelastic demand when it comes to buying individual tracts of land, which most people internationally would want. A couple of clarifications. We're willing them. Whoever goes into those autonomous regions have the ability to either opt in or opt out. Like for example, people who move in from South Africa to work in Lesotho, they can either be a citizen of Lesotho if they choose to. Secondly, we don't think it's going to be anything neo-colonialism. We think that most people realize that the old school kind of colonialism doesn't work anymore, that the economic incentive is always the way to go forward, so we don't think it's going to be a bastion for like invasion or anything of that sort. And lastly, we think that these people, we're going to allow them to have their own security, have their own security guards, but it doesn't necessarily negate our ability to take that plot of land back. Because if you think about it, industries, if you compare them vis-a-vis another state, will never have that disproportionate power. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, why sovereignty is tradable here and something that these first developing countries can give up. Secondly, how this overlaps with the priorities of corporate logic and why we think this will benefit everyone as a whole. And lastly, the economic benefits. So why is sovereignty tradable and why can we think they have the right to sell this up? There are three reasons for this. Firstly, we think that sovereignty is important only insofar as it allows the people within a country to protect themselves in a demarcated boundary because they have authority over that plot of land, because they are able to determine what goes on in that plot of land to ensure some modicum of security for its people. But the moment you're talking about plots of land that have no inherent use or no inherent benefit, we think it makes much more sense, principally and economically, for these countries to sell off that plot of land, get the money in return, to financially protect the people in the other regions where they are populated. We think the financial protection that comes from our policy better fulfills the kind of protection, of principle of protection that sovereignty is supposed to serve. Secondly, we think that, it's the inherent right of these countries to give up plots of their land to other people if they think it's beneficial. We see them giving up plots of land to embassies from other countries in the hope of establishing better relations with their country on the pure economic principle of just wanting to benefit from that relation itself. We think similarly some form of benefit can be accrued from this transaction, and we think they have an inherent right to do that as well, and there's precedents to follow. Thirdly, we think, if we're talking about these developing countries, what is unique about them is that they're usually predicated on more like tribal loyalties or more like community kind of loyalty system that goes on. Meaning that there's a huge disconnect between the individual living in the community and the construct of the nation state. So what we think happens here is they're recognizing that there is significant disconnect between the individual and the construct itself of the nation state. We think we're going to capitalize on that concept, that very valuable concept, and allow the state to make full use of that disconnect to benefit the people in turn. So secondly, why does this overlap with the corporate consensus, and how will that benefit everyone as a whole? Firstly, we think that in status quo, corporations won't necessarily have the national incentive to go in automatically despite the initial economic flurry because of a couple of reasons, right? Firstly, they don't think that there is the keen proprietary interest that they have within that plot of land. We think when people think they have greater degree of control over what they're investing in, we think they'll be more moved or compelled to actually make the investment in the first place. But the moment, like when you don't guarantee that the kind of sovereignty, we don't think that exists. Secondly, people aren't naturally compelled to go into these developing countries because there's always the threat of a coup d'etat, or there's always a threat of some kind of authoritarian regime possibly wanting to pressurize the owners of these MNCs, right? Acting as a natural disincentive. For example, the Ivory Coast. For the longest time, they were one of the most economically prosperous African countries, like anywhere, right? But suddenly when like a coup d'etat came about and everything was like basically a hellhole in that region. And we think the kind of instability and no guarantee of security is a natural disincentive preventing them from coming in. So why do we want them to come in? Because we think that the corporate logic that operates here will ensure the better treatment of people who do work in the region itself, who do work for these companies, or who do work in these fields, for four primary reasons. Firstly, we think that when you're talking about countries like China and the UAE, there is a natural incentive for them to want the locals to buy their goods, right? Because they want to further entrench themselves in the local economy and the local market, so they can benefit continuously, not just from the purchase of land, from the transfer of resources as well. And we think they will definitely guarantee to ensure that the people there are treated well, that the people there aren't necessarily abused with like high prices, and they'll generally guarantee the welfare of these people. Secondly, they want to maintain that they ensure that they remain within the international frameworks because there are massive benefits that ensures that they can only reap once they ensure that they're inside the framework itself. Thirdly, there's no veneer for them to say, look, it's the fault of the particular authoritarian regime and not our fault. Like they'll become like they'll be directly assaulted for any kind of like atrocities they create. And lastly, the threat of force. Lastly, on the idea of economic benefits, we think, like I said earlier in my policy, there will be the kind of transfer of skills that we think is beneficial for these people. We think we need them to gain the initial capital clout for them to move forward. And for these reasons, Mr. Speaker, this important motion must stand.